We are in the second week of a 4-week series that we are doing entitled How to Neighbor. And the reason why we're doing this series is because Jesus left us this pretty huge commandment when he told us to love our neighbor as ourselves. But when you get really honest about the commandment, it can be kind of tough. It's hard to know if we're doing it right or if we're doing it wrong or if we're actually doing what Jesus intended when he told us, love our neighbor as ourselves. And so what we're doing in this series is we are talking about 4 different people groups. Some of them are different than us. Some of them they need things from us. But all of them are groups of people that Jesus would have told us, look, these are the neighbors I was talking about. These are the people that you are supposed to be loving as you love yourself. And so we're talking about these different people groups that are our neighbor, and we're talking specifically about what it looks like to love them the way that Jesus intended. And so last week we kicked off the series by talking about how we love someone of a different race. And if you weren't here last week, man, you really missed some powerful stuff. We really unpacked that, and it was a great week. And if you missed it, though, you can actually go back online and you can watch it. You can go to crosswaychurch.com, crossway.news. You can go to our YouTube channel if you want, and you can catch it there. If you missed last week, I'm urging you, go back and watch it because we shared some pretty important stuff. Well, this week, we're going to talk about a different group of people that we've been called to love. And this week, I want to talk about loving the lonely. If I were to ask you the question, who do you think struggles with loneliness? I'm guessing that probably most of you would answer the same way I would answer. You would probably answer by saying, well, I think somebody else. Perhaps some of you would say, I think older people struggle with loneliness. Or perhaps you might say, well, I think widows or widowers, I think those are the folks that struggle with loneliness. And although I think that certainly, probably both of those people groups do, for a few minutes, what I'd like to do is I would like to expand your thinking about who actually struggles with loneliness. Sociologists have recently observed a brand new and rapidly growing phenomenon in our world that they are calling relational poverty. Now, relational poverty, if you were to define it, essentially what it is, it's the concept, the truth, the principle that more and more and more and more people in our world are lacking the intimacy and the connections that they need to live a meaningful life. This is sociologists speak for people are becoming more and more and more lonely in our world. The reality is that you and I can be surrounded by people all day, every day, and still feel really, really alone. You can be here in this room today and still feel alone. You can be a stay-at-home mom and still deal with this nagging sense that you're alone. You can be a person who goes to a job that you love, a job where you interact with people all day, every day, and still wrestle with this nagging feeling of wondering if do the people around me, do they actually care? Do I matter to them? You can be a college student in a dorm where people are everywhere and there's constant activity. And you can still wrestle with the feeling about, man, do I matter to the people around me? Do they really care about me? Do they actually love me? You can be a person at the height of your career. I mean, you could have your A game going. You could be at the top of your field, the person that everybody looks up to, the person that people want to get advice from, the person whose team everybody wants to be on. And still wonder if you can really trust the people around you. You could be in a dysfunctional marriage. And maybe it didn't start out that way. Maybe it started out highly functional. But then life happened, and in subtle and not so subtle ways, you began to drift apart. And perhaps you go to bed at night, and you lay in a bed next to somebody that you feel like barely knows you, and you barely know them. The truth is that relational poverty is a growing epidemic in our world today. We are becoming increasingly more and more and more lonely. Now, interestingly, sociologists have kind of pointed to about 4 different things that are causing the loneliness that invades our world today. Some have suggested that, it's the breakdown of families. And if you've ever been divorced, you know what this is like. You get divorced, and then, after the divorce or in the process of getting divorced, somewhere along the line, you got to figure out, okay, how does this church thing go? Do I stay and he find another church, or how's this work? Or maybe I can sit in another part of the church, and maybe we won't have to interact with each other. And then there's the whole friends dynamic. Before you got divorced, you had friends who were close, friends that you thought were ride or die, and that you were really tight with them. And then you get a divorce, and you got to figure out, oh my goodness, because your friends are now acting funny. They're keeping a distance. Some of them are choosing sides, and you end up losing friendships. You see, the breakdown of families is without a doubt feeding the loneliness that we feel. Also, people have pointed this out. Maybe it has to do with increased mobility. If you're to rewind the clock several generations, most people were born, lived their life, and died in the same town. Some of them in the same home. But we move a lot. We move around the city, we move from city to city, and there's nothing really wrong with that, but the problem is it's feeding the loneliness. It's causing us to have increased difficulty in creating meaningful relationships that lead to a meaningful life. Some people have suggested that maybe it has to do with heavy workloads. I mean, we're just busy people, aren't we? In fact, Americans are busier now than they have ever been in the course of history. We try to cram everything we can into every single day, and our calendars are full, and it leaves us with little to no margin to create meaningful connections in our life. And it leaves us feeling alone and wrestling with feelings of loneliness. But also, the rise of social media has contributed to the loneliness that we feel. And I know it seems like a little bit of a strange thing to say, because the whole point of social media is connection. But what sociologists are saying and what experts are saying is it actually does just the opposite of what we're hoping that it does. Social media certainly has its benefits, but here's what we do when we're feeling alone. We take a picture, we take a selfie, and we post it online, and we wait. We wait, we wait, we wait, and we wonder who's going to like it and how many people are going to like it, and is somebody going to comment, and if they do comment, what are they going to say? And if we get a lot of likes and a lot of comments, we feel good about ourselves. And if we don't get a lot of likes and we don't get a lot of comments, we feel bad about ourselves. And regardless of how the scenario plays out, experts tell us that really what we're doing is we're merely delaying loneliness. We're just deferring it to another time. Loneliness and relational poverty are reaching crisis proportions in our country. And there's not a single one of us that are not going to be affected by it. It doesn't matter how many people you know, how many connections you have. At some point in time, in some way, shape, form, or fashion, every single one of us are going to wrestle with relational poverty. We're going to wrestle with loneliness. So the question that I want us to wrestle with this morning is, how do we love people who are lonely? How do we love a group of people who Jesus has instructed us to love? How do we love a group of people that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger every single day? Now, thankfully, the very one who gave us the instruction to love our neighbor as ourselves, he actually modeled this for us. He didn't just leave us with this sort of ambiguous set of instructions. He actually practiced this in his own life, where he put it on full display. So I want to talk for a few minutes with you about 3 things that Jesus did that every single one of us need to also do as we love the lonely. The first thing that Jesus did to love the lonely was he loved with touch. There's this interesting story that takes place in Matthew chapter 8. Jesus is walking down from a mountain, And there's a large crowd of people that have gathered around him, and they're walking down this road with him. And I kind of imagine that Jesus does what Jesus often did. He didn't waste a single moment. So as they walk down the road, he's talking to these guys, and he's teaching, and he's answering questions, and he's speaking words of encouragement, and he's just ministering as they walk down the road. And everything is going along just fine until Matthew chapter 8, verse 2 happens. It says, a man with leprosy. And I want to kind of stop there and explain leprosy, because leprosy is not really common in our world, but it was extraordinarily common in Jesus' world. It was the disease that nobody, absolutely nobody wanted to get. In fact, the way they thought about it as an absolute death sentence. Because as soon as a person was discovered to have leprosy, there were some extreme things that happened to that person. They were immediately ostracized and kicked out of the community. They could no longer live at their home or engage with their family. They lost their job, their means of employment. They lost their place of worship. They couldn't go into their church anymore, and they were literally kicked out of the city. There were all kinds of rules regarding what a leper could do and what a leper could not do. And all kinds of rules about what a person could do regarding a leper and what a person could not do regarding a leper. In fact, it seems like when you read the biblical accounts of lepers, they lost their name too, because from here on out, they were just referred to as lepers. They were forced outside of the community. And they had a bell that hung around their neck. And the purpose of the bell was to warn people about their presence in the area. And when people saw lepers and when they heard that bell, they would literally cry out, unclean, unclean, unclean. So as soon as they heard that bell and they heard somebody scream that, people would literally run for the hills. They would run away as far and as fast as they possibly could. In ancient days, they thought that leprosy was wildly contagious. Needless to say, being a leper was a lonely way of life. But the disease itself was actually a pretty horrible disease. The way it would start off with fatigue and joint pain, and then as the thing would progress, over time, you would get these scales that would kind of cover your body in different places, and then the disease would again progress over time, and then eventually a person would have lumps all over their body that were filled with pus. There were actually, I know it's gross, right? There were some types of leprosy that would deaden the nerve endings in people's extremities. And so they would end up losing fingers or hands or arms or feet or toes, and they wouldn't even know it. As the disease progressed, there would be these growths that would happen on their vocal cords, and it would literally change their voice. And over time, it would start to attack their facial structure, and they would start to look less and less like a human being and more like an animal. And then, because this disease was literally eating away at their flesh, these people would develop a stench that was almost impossible to describe. Needless to say, being a leper was a very difficult way of life. Nobody wanted to be around a leper, and the last thing anybody wanted to do was to actually touch one. So Jesus and this crowd are walking down the street, and everything's going along just normal, just fine. And they look up, and standing there is a leper. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. The leper doesn't ask Jesus for anything. He doesn't ask Jesus, say, look, Jesus, can you help me? Jesus, will you have compassion on me? Jesus, will you heal my leprosy? He just simply makes a statement about what he believes is true about Jesus. Jesus, I know who you are. I know the power that you have. I know what you can do, and I know you can change my life if you decide to. Now, the Bible doesn't actually record what I'm about to tell you. But I kind of imagine this is what's happened, because this is what generally happened in their culture when they encountered a leper. As Jesus is standing there, the leper's there, Jesus is here. Someone starts to cry out, unclean, unclean. And people start to panic. And everybody starts to back up and create distance between them and the leper, because they don't want leprosy. And maybe there's a guy over to the side that notices that Jesus hasn't moved, that Jesus isn't moving back like everybody else. And maybe they even start to coach Jesus. Hey, Jesus, this is not a good thing. This is kind of unsafe. You need to back up. Jesus, get some distance. It's not good. But in the next verse we read, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. So while everybody else was creating distance, Jesus is closing the gap until he reaches out and he touches this man. You know, this man could have had leprosy for 5 years. This might have been the first touch this man has actually had from a person in 5 years. And for a moment, I want us to imagine that we're in Jesus' place. I know we're not Jesus, we're not God, but let's just imagine that we're Jesus. You know what I think that most of us would be doing? I think most of us would be doing what everybody else was doing, creating some distance, staying hands off. Maybe we would offer up to pray for the person from a distance. And the interesting thing to me about the story is that Jesus touched this man and he totally didn't have to. I mean, when you read through the biographies about Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there were several instances where Jesus healed people just by speaking words. In fact, there's this one incident where one of his best friends, Lazarus, was dead. He'd been dead for 4 days, which basically means you're as dead can possibly get. And they put him into his tomb, and they're about to roll the stone over and seal it. Jesus stands outside of the cave, outside of the tomb, and simply says, Lazarus, come forth. Lazarus raises from the dead and comes out. Jesus totally doesn't have to touch this guy at all to heal him. So why does Jesus touch him? Why does Jesus choose to touch someone that nobody else would touch? You see, I think it's because Jesus knew. I think it's because Jesus knew that this man didn't just need healing from the disease that was eating at his body. He needed healing from the loneliness that was eating at his soul. And Jesus knew that the way to do that was to simply reach out and touch him. I really think that we underestimate the power of a godly, appropriate touch. A godly, appropriate touch can communicate so much. I have a foster daughter at my home. She's right around 3 years old. And for the first 2.5 years of her life, neglected isn't even strong enough word. Her mom almost never touched her. She's been in my home now for about 3.5 months. And I've seen the hunger in her to be touched. Because she suffered with loneliness. She knows what that's about. She knows what it feels like to be unwanted, unloved, uncared for. And every single morning when I wake her up, she insists on being hugged. You can see it, she just craves it, and she reaches up and she's doing this. And so I reach down and I pick her up and I hold her, and her body melts into mine. And she just relaxes. Because in that moment, here's what she hears. I love you. You're important. You matter. You can trust me. And several times a day, she'll come back for more. I don't tell you about my foster daughter because I want you to feel sorry for her. And I'm not telling you about my foster daughter because I want you to think I'm a great guy, because I'm not. I'm telling you about my foster daughter because I want you to know that there are people that you pass by and you encounter every single day that are wrestling with the same kind of loneliness. And you would not believe what a hug would do to them, or a handshake, or a pat on the back. We love lonely people with godly, appropriate touch. But we also love them by listening. You know, if we get really, really, really honest, most of us don't listen to people to try to understand them. You know what most of us do most of the time? We listen to people in order to reply or respond. What we do while they're talking is we wait until they're done talking, or we wait until they pause long enough so that we can tell them what we want to tell them. But if we're going to actually love people who are lonely, we have to love them by listening. And Jesus was the best listener ever. In fact, he actually models this for us in Luke chapter 24. And before I show you what he did, let me give you a little bit of backstory about what happened. In Luke chapter 24, there are two guys that are walking down the road. They're walking away from Jerusalem, and these two guys, they believed with all their heart that Jesus was the Messiah, the long-awaited Messiah. And when they thought about Messiah, here's what they thought about what the Messiah would do. They thought that Jesus was going to be the one that would rise up and free them from Roman rule and Roman occupation. They thought that Jesus was going to be the one who would rise up and restore the nation of Israel to international power, international prominence, and international prosperity. That's who they thought Jesus was. And they probably have thought this for a long time. Chances are they've had many conversations about what the future was going to look like when Jesus was finally going to build his kingdom that he kept talking about. They didn't know that Jesus was talking about building a heavenly kingdom. They thought he was talking about building an earthly one. But they had dreams and they had hopes and they had all kinds of things. They imagined a future and they talked about a future where there would be no struggle, where there would be no difficulty, where there wouldn't be scarcity anymore, where there'd be no more oppression. And every hope and every dream and every thought about the future for them rested on Jesus and what they thought that he was going to do. And they were excited and they were looking forward to it until Jesus was crucified on a cross. And when Jesus died on that cross, so did every one of their hopes and every one of their dreams. And for the next couple days, I imagine they just wandered around Jerusalem, sort of dumbfounded, trying to figure it out, sort of sorting through the wreckage of their shattered hopes and dreams. And then all of a sudden, there's this strange rumor going around town that Jesus has risen from the dead, and they're not really sure what to think about that or what to make about it. They're confused, and they don't know what to do, so they just decide, you know what, I guess it's over. Let's just go home. And so they're walking down this road, sorting through all this stuff. They're discouraged, they're disillusioned, they're disenfranchised, and they're depressed, and they're just trying to talk it out. Well, as they walk down this road, Jesus shows up and he starts walking right next to them. But they don't know that it's him. And we're not sure why they don't know it's Jesus. Maybe it was dark and they couldn't tell it was him, or maybe they were so caught up in their situation that they didn't notice him, or maybe God himself kept them from knowing. It really doesn't matter. They didn't know Jesus was there. He walks up as they're talking about him, and as they're walking down the road, I kind of expect Jesus would go, "Hey guys, it's me." But Jesus does something radically different. Here's what we read. He, talking about Jesus, he asked them, "What are you guys discussing together as you walk along?" As if Jesus didn't know. And so imagine they sort of stop and they scratch their heads, and we read, they stood still, their faces downcast. And in the next verse we read, one of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here in these last few days?" In other words, dude, have you been living under a rock? Like, how do you not know? Everybody's talking about this. Everybody everywhere knows. Look, even people who don't live in Jerusalem have heard about what happened here, and they're talking about it. How do you not understand our pain? How do you not understand our disillusionment? How do you not understand why we're so depressed? Now, again, at this point, I think Jesus has a golden opportunity to go, hey guys, it's me. Don't worry, everything's going to be okay. But Jesus chooses a different path. In the next verse, he goes, what things? Now that is crazy. Essentially what Jesus did was he asked them to explain to him what had happened to him. Like there's no bigger expert on what happened than Jesus. All of it happened to him. Nobody's going to know better than Jesus. But Jesus goes, hey guys, just tell me what things. Explain it to me. This is kind of like Chopin asking a 5-year-old to teach him how to play a chord on the piano. It's kind of like Michelangelo coming to a 5-year-old and going, hey, teach me how to paint. I mean, Jesus, by every right at this point, he has the right to respond a number of ways. He could have been indignant. He could have been patronizing. He could have been super sensitive. I mean, because at the end of the day, it was Jesus who was abandoned. It was Jesus who was beaten. It was Jesus who was stripped naked. It was Jesus who had the crown of thorns shoved on his head. It was Jesus whose beard was ripped out. It was Jesus whose hands and feet were nailed to the cross where he suffocated to death. But instead, Jesus looks at these guys and essentially goes, tell me about me. Tell me about what happened, guys. And he does it as if he doesn't know. And we won't read it, but these guys, they unload. And they tell Jesus his own name. They tell Jesus where he came from. They tell Jesus what he was doing. They told Jesus what they expected him to do. And you know what Jesus did? He just listened. He listened patiently. And I don't know about you, but I keep wondering, Jesus, why didn't you just reveal yourself and end their pain? And I think the reason why Jesus didn't do that is because Jesus was modeling something for us. You know, there are some people, they don't need you or me to fix their problem. In fact, I would argue many people don't need us to fix their problem. You know what they need? They need to be heard. They need to know that there's someone out there who understands and actually cares. They need someone who's willing to do this, who's willing to focus on being interested, not on being interesting. And in case you're uncertain of how to do this, just do what Jesus did. Ask questions. You know, some of the most powerful questions you may ask somebody in the middle of their pain goes like this. Hey, how can I pray for you? Or, I heard that happen to you. Can you tell me about that? Or you could ask them, how are you doing really? You got to add the word really at the end because we give superficial answers to the first part. But there's something about when you add that word really at the end that people start to really open up. You know, you and I tend to think about conversations as like they went well if we did a lot of talking. But what Jesus modeled for us and what the experts are actually saying is that the best conversationalists are the people who draw things out of people. The best conversationalists are the best listeners. We need to love people by actually listening. Before I move on to the other thing I want to talk about, I'd like to remind you that the word listen and the word silent have the same letters in it. It's powerful what happens when we listen to people. But we love people through touch, and we love people by listening, but we also love people with our time. When you read through the biographies of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you focus in on the parts where he was, the 3.5 years in his public ministry, you can't help but notice that Jesus was always on the move. He was always on the go. He was always going somewhere. He was always going somewhere to teach, or going somewhere to preach, or going somewhere to pray, or going somewhere to heal someone, or going somewhere to do a miracle. He was always on the move. But the interesting thing to me about Jesus' life is that although he was busy, he was never too busy to be interrupted. One of my favorite stories about Jesus actually happens in Luke chapter 5. In Luke chapter 5, Jesus is in a city that he's never been in before. And so he gets to the city, and people everywhere hear about his presence, and they gather up to encounter Jesus and listen to him teach and maybe ask for a favor, a miracle, or something like that. And eventually, Jesus finds himself in the middle of a house, and the house is jammed full of people. And even people, a large crowd of people have gathered around the house, and Jesus is in the middle of the house, and he's teaching, doing his thing, and people are literally hanging on every word. There are even Pharisees that are there they're not in love with Jesus, obviously, but they're at least listening and trying to digest what Jesus is saying. And while all that's going on, there are 4 people in that city who are friends who had a friend that was paralyzed. And they've heard about Jesus, they've heard that he can heal, they've heard that he's done miracles, and they get this idea. Look, let's take our friend to Jesus. Maybe Jesus can do something. Maybe Jesus will do something. So they go get their paralyzed friend who's apparently laying on a mat. They pick him up and they take him to the building where Jesus is at. When they get there, they quickly realize that they can't get in there to see Jesus because of the crowd. So they kind of stand there, I imagine, dejected for a little while. And then one guy gets an out-of-the-box thought. He goes, hey, what if we took him to the roof and busted through the roof and just lowered him down? And I'm sure one of the friends went, dude, I don't know, man. Look, I don't think they're going to appreciate that. And then the other guy goes, when are we going to get another chance? So they haul this guy up to the roof, they bust a hole in the roof, and they lower him down right there in the middle of everything, right in front of Jesus. And what's interesting is what Jesus doesn't do. Jesus doesn't scold these guys for the interruption. He doesn't belittle them for taking up some of his precious time. He doesn't ignore them. He doesn't go on as if they're not there and just kind of continue and turn to everybody else and go, okay, point 3 in my sermon. Jesus literally stops everything that he's doing. And here's what we read about what happened next. When Jesus saw their faith, he said, friend, your sins are forgiven. So he said to the paralyzed man, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. Immediately he stood up in front of them, took what he had been lying on the ground, and went home praising God. There are so many lessons we can glean from that story. But the one I want to point out this morning is the one that has to do with interruptions. The one that has to do with what happens when people interrupt what we have going on. I think if there's anything that story teaches us, it teaches us that the person that God has placed in front of us is God's assignment for us. I want you to know that. I want you to know that whoever God has placed in your life, whoever God has placed in front of you, is God's assignment for you. And you know, if we all took that mentality and we just loved those people that God put in front of us, you know, I think relational poverty would be nearly non-existent. I want you to know that there are some people in your life, no matter how busy you are, and look, we're all busy, but there are some people in your life, even though you're extraordinarily busy, who are longing for just a little bit of your time. And you know, one of the best ways that you can love them is to give them some of your time. Just give it to them. You see, I'm afraid that we become so burdened and so busy in our culture with things that are urgent. We fill our calendars with things that are urgent. And we're running around doing things that are urgent. And we're so controlled by it that oftentimes we don't have the time for important things. We just run around doing things that feel urgent. Earlier this year, my wife Stacy's grandmother passed away after a pretty lengthy battle with cancer. It wasn't her first battle with cancer, it just ended up being her last battle. And it got to the very end there, and everybody kind of knew we probably have just a couple weeks at most. And so Stacy decided, along with her sister and her parents, to load up and go to Arkansas and to see her grandmother one more time. And I got to tell you, there was absolutely nothing about that trip that was convenient for us. It wasn't convenient timing for my wife. It wasn't convenient time for me. It wasn't convenient time for our family. It was just inconvenient. But they decided to go because they felt like, man, if we don't go, we will regret it one day. While they were there on one particular night, they decided for the span of about 2 or 3 hours to interview Stacy's grandmother. And they asked her about her life and her upbringing and her childhood and different things about her life. And they learned so much about her. And at the very end, just before they were able to come home, each one of them was able to look that woman in the face and tell her how they felt. So Stacy came home and she told me about all that. And you know, that trip was a few months ago or so. You know, there's not a single thing about that trip that I regret. I don't at all regret being inconvenienced. You want to know what I do regret, though? I do regret that we didn't do that more often when we had time. I do regret that there were probably moments in Stacy's grandmother's life where she was lonely. And she needed to know she mattered to somebody. And we weren't there. We couldn't be inconvenienced. I'm begging you, don't let the urgent crowd out the important. Love the people that God has put in front of you because they are God's assignment for you. And that's how we love the lonely. We love the lonely with touch. We love the lonely by listening. And we love the lonely with our time. So I want to challenge every single one of you to do something. Because I don't want us to be the type of church that just talks about stuff like this. Because it's not okay that there are lonely people in our world that don't feel loved. It's not okay. And as a church, we have to be better than just being a group of people that are talking about it. We have to be a group of people that are actually doing something about it. So I want to challenge you to do something that I'm just calling the kindness challenge. Around the perimeter of our room here, you've probably noticed these weird-looking wall things with these things hanging on it. Those are actually envelopes that are hanging on those little strings on the walls. I'm not even sure what to call those things. But inside each and every one of those envelopes is something called a kindness card. My kindness card says this. There's 3 different ideas of things on each one of these cards that we can do to be kind to somebody. And so mine says this. 1, send an extra thank you gift to a teacher at your child's school. 2, help your neighbor with a project or yard work. Or 3, learn the name of someone serving you and use it during your interaction. So here's what I want to challenge all of us to do. Each, by the way, there's all kinds of different cards up there. What I want you to do before you leave today is I want you to go by and I want you to grab one of these cards. And don't do that thing where you open it and go, I don't like those options and look for a different card. Just take the one you got, okay? Just take it as that's God's way of saying he wants you to do one of those, okay? Don't start getting selective with your cards. But take one of these cards and find one of these things that you feel like you can do. And in the next week, between now and next Sunday, just do it. Just do it. Together, let's go love the lonely. Take the card when you leave today, please. And let's make a difference in our world.